والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين. باسم مكتب التربية العربية دول الخليج نرحب بالجميع بالزملاء والزميلات وكافة المشاركين والمشاركات من كل أقطار الوطن العربي ومن الدول الأعضاء بمكتب التربية العربية دول الخليج. وفي مستهل هذا اللقاء والذي يأتي ضمن سلسلة فعاليات مكتب التربية العربية دول الخليج، وهذا اللقاء هو اللقاء الرابع، وبإذن الله سوف تتوالى فعاليات المكتب خلال الأسابيع والأشهر القادمة، يعني خدمة لقضايا التربية والتعليم وقضايا العمل التربوي المشترك، وأيضا التوجهات المستقبلية لمسيرة العمل التربوي في مكتب التربية العربي دول الخليج وفي الوطن العربي، وأيضا مستفيدين من التجارب العالمية والدولية. ويشرفنا باسم مكتب التربية العربية دول الخليج وباسم معالي المدير العام الدكتور علي بن عبد الخالق القرني أن نرحب بكم أجمل ترحيب، ونبدأ هذه الجلسة. وأترك الميكروفون للبروفيسور فهد الشايع، عميد كلية التربية بجامعة الملك سعود، وهو قامة عربية تربوية معروفة، الذي سوف يدير هذا اللقاء بمشيئة الله، والذي سيمتد من الساعة 1:30 حتى الساعة 2:30. وقبل أن أترك الميكروفون إليه أريد أن أنوه إلى 3 قضايا أساسية. القضية الأولى، أولا العرض، موجود عرض باللغة العربية واللغة الإنجليزية، وقد تم إرساله عبر الرابط المرسل إليكم جميعا، وإذا لم يتم إرساله سوف يتم إرساله لمن يرغب. ثانيا، المحاضرة سوف تكون باللغة الإنجليزية، وهناك ترجمة موجودة على الأيقونة الموجودة في شكل الكرة الأرضية، بالإمكان الضغط عليها واختيار اللغة الفرنسية لكي تدخلوا إلى اللغة العربية، واللغة الإنجليزية سوف تكون هي اللغة الأساسية التي سيتحدث فيها المتحدث. النقطة الثالثة وهي الشهادات. هناك شهادات سوف تصدر لكل المشاركين الذين شاركونا اليوم، شرط أن يتم التسجيل، شرط أن يتم الحضور لأكثر من 60% من جلسات هذا اللقاء. بالتوفيق إن شاء الله. دكتور فهد تفضل.
شكرا دكتور عبد السلام. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله، ثم ما بعد، فأرحب بجميع الزملاء والزميلات المشاركين معنا في هذا اللقاء الذي ينظمه مكتب التربية لدول الخليج العربي. وكما ذكر أخي معالي الدكتور عبد السلام أن هذا اللقاء ضمن سلسلة من اللقاءات اللي ينظمها المكتب خلال هذه الفترة. ويسعدني في البداية أن أتقدم بوافر الشكر والتقدير لمكتب التربية على هذه الجهود الإقليمية والدولية التي تصب في تطوير التعليم في دول الخليج وأيضا في المنطقة العربية وفي العالم أجمع. كما أتقدم بوافر الشكر والتقدير لمعالي الدكتور علي القرني على اهتمام الشخصي بهذه الموضوعات، وقد حقيقة هاتفني يوم أمس وطلب مني أن أنقل تقديره لكم جميعا وحرصه على المشاركة والحضور معكم هذا اليوم، لولا ارتباطات مسبقة لديه حالت دون مشاركته معنا في هذا اليوم، وكان حقيقة مهتم جدا لحضور هذا اللقاء، فله وافر الشكر والتقدير. وافر الشكر والتقدير أيضا لكم جميعا المشاركين معنا والحاضرين في هذا اللقاء، والذي نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى أن يكون لقاء مفيدا ونافعا للجميع. يشرفنا ويسعدنا أن يكون ضيف هذا اللقاء سعادة الدكتور صبحي الطويل. والدكتور صبحي الطويل هو مدير فريق مستقبل التعلم والابتكار في التعليم في منظمة اليونسكو، وقد عمل الدكتور صبحي في أبحاث سياسات التعليم وإدارة البرامج مع منظمات متنوعة مثل اللجنة الدولية للصليب الأحمر والمعهد العالي للدراسات الدولية والإنمائية في جنيف وشبكة السياسات الدولية والتعاون في التعليم والتدريب ومكتب التربية الدولي لليونسكو، وكذلك المكتب العنقودي للمغرب العربي في الرباط. والدكتور حاصل على درجة الدكتوراه في التربية والتنمية من جامعة جنيف. فنحن مع خبير دولي له إسهاماته الكبيرة في عدد من المنظمات الدولية، ويعني مكتب التربية يحرص دائما على انتقاء ضيوفه الذين يقدمون الإضافة العلمية للجميع. فأنا سعداء كثيرا بمشاركة وحضور الدكتور صبحي. الدكتور صبحي يفضل أن يقدم عرضه باللغة الإنجليزية، ولكنه هو أيضا يستطيع ويستوعب الحديث في اللغة العربية بشكل جيد، فلذلك تقديمي أنا سيكون في اللغة العربية، وأما محاضرة الدكتور سوف تكون باللغة الإنجليزية. ومن رغب بالاستماع لترجمة المحاضرة المباشرة باللغة العربية ممكن أن يذهب كما ذكر الدكتور عبد السلام إلى أيقونة الكرة الأرضية الموجودة لديكم، ومن ثم اختيار نوع اللغة والانتقال بين اللغتين. موضوعنا في هذا اليوم يتناول التعليم والتنمية والمستقبل المشترك. لا شك أن القضايا أصبحت الآن هي قضايا أممية. لم يصبح كل بلد لديه اهتمامه المستقل فقط. هذا ليس فقط في التعليم بل بالاقتصاد بل في الصحة حاليا مع هذه الجائحة التي نعيش بها. فلا يستطيع أي بلد كان أن يعزل نفسه عن محيطه الإقليمي أو محيطه العالمي. فهذا التأثر والتأثير أصبح ظاهرة هذا العصر، وزاد هذا التأثر والتأثير مع تطور التقنية بشكل كبير. فأصبح العمل المشترك ضروري للدول، كما أصبح أيضا النظرة للمستقبل المشترك بين الدول نظرة حتمية وليست نظرة اختيارية للدول أو للمنظمات. فأصبح مستقبل هذا العالم هو مستقبل مشترك لا يمكن أن ينعزل فيه بلد أو مجتمع عن العالم بشكل عام. لهذا السبب نجد أن منظمة اليونسكو حددت في خطتها في أهداف التنمية المستدامة من 2015 ل 2030 حددت وركزت الهدف الرابع في مجال التعليم، وصاغته بضمان التعليم الجيد المنصف والشامل للجميع، وتعزيز فرص التعلم مدى الحياة للجميع لا يستثني بلدا عن بلد أو يستثني فئة عن فئة أو يستثني موقعا عن آخر. وحدد أيضا لتحقيق هذا الهدف 7 غايات و3 وسائل الجميع يعلمها وممكن يطلع عليها. لماذا مستقبل مشترك؟ أنا في ظني أن هذا الأمر له عدد من المحاور التي جعلت فعلا يجب أن ننظر إلى المستقبل المشترك وإلى قضايا أن التعليم والتنمية هما اللذان سوف يصنعان المستقبل المشترك للعالم. المستقبل المشترك يتطلب قيم إنسانية مشتركة. هذه القيم الإنسانية المشتركة يجب أن يتوافق عليها العالم، وأن تكون قيم إنسانية مشتركة مضمنة في تعليمه ومضمنة في ممارساته. الجانب الاقتصادي التأثير والتأثر فيه واضح جدا، ولذلك أصبح هنالك مستقبل مشترك لدول العالم. الجانب البيئي أيضا هذا واضح فيه، وجوانب المناخ، وهذا أيضا يقود إلى مستقبل مشترك. الجانب الصحي وقد تعزز بوضوح في الجائحة الحالية، لا يمكن أن ينعزل مجتمع عن مجتمع آخر، فما يحدث في مجتمع سوف ينتقل إلى مجتمع الآخر. هذا كله يقودنا إلى أهمية النظر للتنمية المستدامة المشتركة في العالم، ولا يمكن تحقيق تنمية مستدامة في بلد دون الاشتراك في العالم. لعلنا نرجع إلى تاريخنا الإسلامي ومفهوم عمارة الأرض التي استخلفنا الله سبحانه وتعالى فيها. هذا الاستخلاف يتطلب منا تحقيق التوازن بين تحقيق متطلبات الحاضر دون المساس باحتياجات وتطلعات وحقوق الأجيال القادمة. هذه معادلة مهمة جدا لابد أن نعيها في تحقيق التنمية، لأنهم أيضا حق في عمارة هذه الأرض ولهم حق في مقدرات هذه الأرض. هذه المقدمة حول التنمية وحول المستقبل المشترك لابد أن يقوده حراك في الجانب التعليمي، كيف نحقق هذا الجانب المشترك في التعليم والتنمية والمستقبل المشترك بين دول العالم. هذه قضية يعني تنموية عالمية مهمة. احنا يسعدنا في هذا اليوم أن يكون المتحدث حول هذا الموضوع اللي حاولت أن أقدم له مقدمة بسيطة لبيان أهمية هذا الموضوع ومحوريته سواء على المستوى المحلي أو الإقليمي أو العالمي. خير من يحدثنا على هذا الموضوع الدكتور صبحي الطويل، وقد قدمت بمقدمة له قبل قليل، وإن سمحت سوف نتيح له الفرصة الآن ليقدم العرض لديه، وسوف يكون يمكن تقديمه باللغة الإنجليزية كما ذكرت. الذي يرغب بالترجمة يمكن أن ينتقل للترجمة، وسوف يكون حديثه بحدود من نصف ساعة إلى 40 دقيقة تقريبا ليقدم لنا العرض مكتملا، ثم سوف نعود للأسئلة. بالنسبة للأسئلة والمداخلات رجاء حتى أستطيع ضبط هذا الجزء، الشات يكون فيه ما يتعلق بالأسئلة للمختصين عن قضية التسجيل والشهادات وإلى آخره. question and answer هذا يكون للأسئلة للدكتور صبحي، فأتمنى استخدام question and answer لأنه الآن يعني هو اللي تقريبا فيه فقط 16 سؤال الآن، أما الشات يعني طويل ويصعب عليه تتبعه. فآمن من الزملاء تخصيص الأسئلة الموجهة للدكتور صبحي بكتابتها في الكويستشن اند انسر حتى استطيع تلخيصها والاتجاه في نهايه هذا اللقاء للدكتور صبحي للاجابه عن اسئلتكم. لعلي الان اعتذر ان اطلت بهذه المقدمه، ولعلنا الان نعطي المجال للدكتور صبحي مشكورا ليقدم محاضرته مشكورا. تفضل دكتور صبحي.
شكرا كثير الدكتور فهد للمقدمة وللفرصة لنقدم أفكار حول موضوع التعليم والتنمية والمستقبل المشترك. مثل ما قلت، وشكرا للدكتور عبد السلام من المكتب العربي في دول الخليج. صرنا 5 سنين عم نشتغل سوا، وشكرا كثير لهالفرصة وتنظيم هذا اللقاء. مثل ما قلت راح أقدم بالإنجليزي، وراح أحاول تابع بنفس الوقت الكويشن اند انسرز. لحد الآن هلا طلعت شفت الناس عم يسلموا وعم بس لحد الآن ما شفت الأسئلة. فينا نرجع على الأسئلة بالآخر، وهلا إذا ممكن نقدم العرض بالإنجليزي وبالإذن. شكرا كثير. Look, I'd just like to start by saying shared futures, and I think the introduction of Dr. Fahad was excellent in giving the sense of why we're speaking of shared futures. Education, after all, is first and foremost a collective endeavor. It's just good to remind ourselves of this. Education really is about the institutional transmission of knowledge, of skills, of values from one generation to another. It's about socialization of younger generations. It's about the transmission of accumulated and valued knowledge. And societies have always organized this transmission, institutionalized this transmission in some manner. In pre-industrial societies, this was often through religious systems related to the mosque, to the church, to the temple, or to other religious institutions. In the developing out of the 19th century and 20th century in modern industrial or post-industrial societies. This transmission is through the model of mass schooling, one of the main institutions and one of the main instruments of building modern nation states. And it's a model which, the schooling model, is remarkably similar from one context to another, regardless of local specificities, cultural specificities, even economic and social specificities. A primary school in Mauritania or Nepal would be organized along the same principles as would a primary school in Brazil or in France, in terms of age-based classes, cohorts, knowledge organized around subject matter and curriculum-based teaching, examinations, etc. But regardless of the model, it's the collective and social function of education which is important for us to look at, and which is the focus of this presentation. As Dr. Fahad also rightly pointed out in the presentation, in the context of accelerated globalization, of growing interdependence of our societies in terms of environmental issues, health issues, economic integration, technology, communication, there is a growing recognition that our futures, or the future of any society, is increasingly linked to the futures of other societies and to our collective future. So it's really clear, and I think there is a recognition now that the future of any society is really linked, fundamentally linked to the future of humanity and the planet. It's about societal development and our collective, our common, and our shared future. So why the shared future? We also have many different lenses for looking at education and for looking at education and the future. As we know, education, everyone is concerned with education. So each group of stakeholders have their perspective, whether it is children, youth, students, their families, whether it's government authorities, whether it's employers or civil society organizations, all have their perspective on education and what to expect from education and how they see the future. For many, education is about securing jobs and a better future for oneself, for one's family. And here, in this perspective, education is often seen as an individual commodity or a service or an investment that an individual and a family makes. And that will define this investment, which will define the prospects for a better future, job opportunities, a standard of living, a level of income. For others, it's about the labor market and economic development, and the focus and the purpose that would be stressed is around producing the workforce with the right skill sets. It's both about a solid foundation of basic literacy, as well as specific vocational and professional skills. And increasingly, as we know, with the changing labor market, much of the discussion in the past years, and still is, about ensuring 21st century skills, soft skills, transferable skills, transversal skills. There are many labels for this, but basically a set of skills that would allow to adapt to changing circumstances and to give workers and the labor force a competitive advantage in being able to adapt and to seize opportunities. Generally, when we look at the literature on the future and on education, this is the focus. It's either the individual perspective or the broader economic perspective. But there's much less about broader development issues, about how we see the world in the future, about what are probable futures and what are possible futures, and how education relates to these visions. The terms of probable futures and possible futures appears like a subtle distinction, but it's an important one. Excuse me. Probable futures are really about what is likely to happen. It's about trying to predict, to anticipate a kind of foresight exercise of what is likely to happen, how development and different dimensions of development may play out. And focus, as we said, certainly around the economy, but we could look and consider other aspects. And this is what planners do. Educational planners will be looking at what we can anticipate in terms of change in the future. In a way, we can say this is imposed futures. This is the futures that is likely to happen, probable and imposed, and we must adapt to this change. But on the other hand, we could also consider possible futures. And this is more about visioning. It's not only about what is likely to happen in terms of development trends, but what is desirable. What directions do we want to take? How do we want to see different dimensions of our collective development efforts, whether economic, social, cultural, or otherwise, how we would like to see them develop. And this is, as we said, visioning and more about imagining alternatives. There is, however, when one speaks about the future and a more distant future, if we say, let's look at 2050, for many, this would be considered almost a luxury or an intellectual exercise, visioning the future, looking at 2050, when actually there are immediate needs that we need to respond to. Children and youth that need to be in school, in training, the quality of education and training that needs to be improved, the link between education and training and the labor market, which needs to be improved, and that these are urgent needs of the present. While the visioning exercise is more about what values are important for us, what kind of society do we want to be in the future, and how do we work towards that? So both are necessary, both are complementary, but they are different approaches to looking at the future. In terms of time horizons, when people speak about the future, they mean different things. And within our team here at UNESCO, we have reviewed literature in multiple languages. We know it's predominantly in English, but that looks at, which has any recent publication in the last 5 years that looks at the future, has future in the title, education or knowledge. And what we find is that in most cases, when people are speaking about the future, they're really speaking about now. In some cases, it's a perspective of perhaps 10 years. And it's quite rare to see those who are making projections or looking beyond the 2030 horizon and looking at 2050 or even beyond. So very different understandings of what we mean when we talk about the future. In terms of global agendas, we have the timeline and the time horizon of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda. And even here, the United Nations, marking the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the United Nations this year, is also inviting a conversation about 2045, a time horizon of 2045, not in terms of setting an agenda, but rather in terms of saying, what will the world, what is it likely to look like in 2045, and what should be the role of the United Nations. The African Union, on the other hand, has a timeline of looking at 2063. Why 2063? It's because they did this exercise in 2013, and they basically said, let's do a visioning exercise of 50 years. How do we see Africa in 50 years? Where do we want to be as a continent, our societies in Africa, and in the world as we see it in 50 years? Here at UNESCO, in terms of the futures of education, we are looking at a time horizon of 2050. 2050 in the Futures of Education initiative that we have launched, not to imagine what education will look like in 2050, but what kind of world do we want in 2050? And once we are clearer about where we want to go, then that informs our work in the present and on the role, the purpose of education, the role and organization of learning and how it can contribute. Many do ask the question, I mean, why look at 2050 now? We are in 2020, we have our reality. Why would we look at, we have the pressing needs that we refer to, why would we look at 2050? Why would we look at 2050 when we have a development agenda that has set goals and targets for 2030? And it was mentioned in the introduction, Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is focused on education. We have a number of targets that set and give us the direction for the next 10 years until 2030. Why look at 2050? Why look beyond? And why look beyond, especially when we know that we are not on track to reaching even these goals in the SDG 4? Many, and you will be familiar with the language around the learning crisis, people will say, why look at 2050 when we know that we have still the challenge of out-of-school children and youth? If we look at this graph, the last bar on the bottom is the world average, that we still have some 10% in blue, almost 10% of children who should be primary school around the world who are not. Some 15% of children, adolescents who should be in lower secondary education are not. In upper secondary, that almost or more than a third are not in school. So why speak of 2030 when we have immediate problems of even ensuring access to schools and to formal education? Worse than the questions of access, we know that there are issues of quality, and that even when accessing education, basic education, we cannot always ensure that children and youth are actually acquiring the basic levels of proficiency. What you see on this graph are the share of children and youth who do not reach the minimal proficiency levels in mathematics in blue, or in yellow, the share of children and youth who do not reach minimum reading proficiency levels. And the figures are frightening almost. Almost 60% of young people around the world are not meeting these minimal levels of competency in mathematics and reading, either because they have never attended, they have never been to school, or they have dropped out too early, or even when they have completed certain levels that they have actually, the teaching and the learning has been so poor that they have not acquired these minimal levels. If you look again at the bottom of the graph, these are the shares for North America and Europe, where we would expect, you know, a much better situation. It is much better, but even in this context, 15% almost of young people are considered not to master the basic levels of, not acquiring the basic competencies and levels of proficiency in math and reading. So we have children not in school. We still have this problem. So why look at 2050? We have a problem of the quality of basic education. Why look at 2050 when we have this immediate problem? And thirdly, and if you look at this graph, also quite telling, this is basically the completion rates in secondary education. In red, you have completion rates in upper secondary education, and the completion rates in for lower secondary in blue. Again, if you look at the last bars on the bottom, you get the world average. And what we see in red, 45% of upper secondary school students in the world actually complete that level. This means 45% of students in high school are actually not successfully finishing high school and completing it, and are dropping out or are being pushed out for various reasons. This indicates potentially a question of relevance of education, the content, perhaps the methods, and likely that in today's context, even in a privileged setting, what is being offered to young people can seem disconnected from their reality, especially today in the digital age, where information and knowledge is easily accessible to all through their smartphones and other, and that maybe this model of education is no longer relevant to the realities of young people. There are obviously other reasons for dropping out, which can be related to, you know, economic or health shocks, crisis within the family, the need for young people to work. But to say that worldwide, less than half the students in high school actually complete that level must make us think about the model of education that we are pursuing. Now, why, when we suggest to look at 2050 and look at a longer term horizon, it's because we think it's important that at key moments when we are at a time of rapid, intense change, that it is time for us to, it's not neglect the issues of access and of quality and of relevance of education, but at these moments of societal transformation, we need to lift our heads up for a moment and out of our immediate actions and needs to look at the longer term of where are we heading and where do we want to go. And UNESCO, in its function as a global observatory of societal change, has done this at different key moments in recent history. Look at those key moments and to look at the bigger picture and the implications for education. And the first time this was done, not many people would be familiar with this anymore because this is 50 years ago now. In 1972, one of the key publications entitled Learning to Be. Why 72? This was the late 60s, the early 70s. It was a time when we had two opposing models of development, a socialist development model and a more liberal model. Both of them, although ideologically opposed, very much grounded in a firm belief in scientific progress. It was a time after a wave of independence in many countries in Africa and beyond. It was a time of social transformation with the civil rights movement in the US, for example, the women's liberation movement in parts of the West and other social movements. And this was a moment to think about what is really the purpose of education. And Learning to Be reflected the idea that education is not only about investing in human resource development, not only about economic development, it must be about the education of the whole person. It was this key report that actually introduced the idea of lifelong education and of the learning society. The idea that education is not limited to a period of one's life, nor is it limited to the formal educational and training institutions that we're familiar with. So that was one historical moment. A second historical moment was the mid-90s. And this, some of you may be more familiar with. It was the publication of what we often call the Delors Report, Learning the Treasure Within. The mid-90s. Why the mid-90s? It was the work of Jacques Delors and the International Commission on the Future of Education actually began their work in 1993. It was the end of the Cold War. We seem to be moving to a unipolar world, a kind of triumph of liberal economic models, kind of more instrumental approaches to education. And the success of the Delors Report was to say, again, that education is not just about economic development and preparation for the workforce, but it has multiple purposes: personal and collective, economic, but also social and civic. And again, the Delors Report 1996 was strong in promoting the idea of lifelong learning, and as I said, of an integrated approach to education around the four pillars of education. And many of you might be familiar with these four pillars. It's a simple formula of learning to be, learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together. It was a simple formula to remind ourselves that there are multiple purposes of education: for personal development, for social development, some more economic and practical, but some more social, civic, values oriented, and that we need to keep in mind this integrated approach to education. We can argue that, and we had in 2015, UNESCO put out a short publication entitled Rethinking Education. We could argue that we are now in the second decade of the 21st century, really, in another moment of intense transformation, and it is a right time to be looking at some of these changes. There are paradoxes that mark development trends. If we look at 1990 to 2010, for example, between 1990 and 2010, globally, there was a reduction of poverty by 50%. But at the same time, we've been seeing rising inequality. During this period, 1990-2010, we have had growth, economic growth, but we know, and we realize more and more now, that this has come at the expense of the environment and its effects on climate change. But a third paradox in terms of development trends is also that we live in a world that is more interconnected than ever. We have the internet and various modalities of, we have reduced space and time. We see it with this webinar. We have the generation today of young people who are the most connected, the most informed, the most aware, the most educated, and yet at the same time, we seem to have more polarization and division of our societies. So just to keep moving on, what are some of the probable futures if we're looking longer term? In terms of demography, we see the population growth. Projections for 2050 is that we will be some 10 billion on the planet. A growing share of that population will be African. Today, we have some 15% of the world population is actually in Africa. By 2050, that will be 25% of the population. Every fourth person will be in Africa. By 2100, that will be 40%. So the overall distribution of population and the implications that will have for economies and geopolitics is changing. We also have a population that is aging. By 2050, we say some over 2 billion persons over the age of 60. That will be, if the world population between 1990 and has doubled, there is quadrupling, 4 times a growth in terms of older people within the population, with all the consequences that has in terms of lifelong learning opportunities, healthcare, social welfare, and other needs. We have urbanization. Only recently, around 2010, the world's population became 50% urbanized, but we're moving in that direction. By 2050, 2/3 of the world population will be living in urban centers. In terms of climate, we have seen, and you have heard recently on the news, what much of what is being said about the climate and climate change. Just to give some examples of the increase in temperatures, projections for different cities, but basically projections to say by 2050, a city like London will be as hot as Barcelona. A city like Barcelona will be as hot as Dubai, and that it will have effects at multiple levels, obviously, including in terms of use of water resources and water stress. Here's a map of the world with, in red, regions with the highest levels of water stress. We know in the Middle East, but not only in the Middle East, in other parts. You can see Spain here and countries and regions elsewhere. In terms of projections on environmental damage, the projections of scientists today are much more severe, the predictions are much worse than what they were even 5 years ago. On this map, you see what the projection, 5 years ago, the projection for land that would be flooded in Vietnam by 2050 because of climate change, because of global warming. That same projection was updated. That's what you see on the right. And the projection of scientists only 5 years later is much, much worse than what was expected 5 years ago. And this will have effects. Climate change will have an effect on what we're calling now climate migration. So migration that is also linked to the implications and repercussions of these changes. Technology is obviously an important driver of change, has always been. And there are utopian and more pessimistic views of the future. But just a few quick points. We have obviously digitalization and new digital divides. We have seen it now with coronavirus and the attempts around distance education. Most countries attempted online forms of distance education, but we know in the world that 50% of households are not connected. And digital divides are issues around connectivity, access to connectivity, to devices, but it's also very much a human, it has a human dimension, and it has to do with our digital skills and our abilities to properly use these new technologies. There's fears also about automation in the world of work, and we know that by 2050, many jobs will disappear and many jobs and jobs will be created, but we also know that most jobs will change fundamentally. And there is a question about what is, with artificial intelligence and automation, what is the human competitive advantage? What do humans do best that artificial intelligence and automation cannot do? And that is our creativity. It's also our personal judgment, our value judgment, our ability to make decisions, not only based on fact, but also based on references in terms of values and visions and aspirations that we have collectively. There is obviously the issue of information overload. We have almost overnight gone from societies where information was scarce to societies where we have too much information. And this has clear implications for education in terms of focusing more on the types of skills related to critical media skills, information processing, being able to distinguish between fact and disinformation. We have heard a lot about fake news and in particular in the times now around COVID-19, but not only. So this will become increasingly critical that we know how to learn, how to identify information, how to identify the validity of information, and critically process what we are hearing and seeing in this world where we are bombarded by information from all sides. A final point on technology, and this has been made very clear now with the response to COVID-19 and the educational disruption, is the issue of protection of privacy. Yes, online, but online, the data that is collected on learners, but also on students, who owns that data? What can be done with that data? And what are the limits and the protections that are necessary for individuals relative to their personal data? We know that now in classrooms with, we can go very far in terms of monitoring behaviors, attitudes, levels of interest. Are we not intruding too far in individuals and learners' privacy? And who owns those data, that data, in a context where, and we've seen it now, we're seeing it with COVID-19 response, public education systems are becoming increasingly dependent on commercial technical platforms. Who owns that data that is related to online learning, and how can that be governed? In the context of Europe, there are, since recently, legislation to regulate and to protect the privacy of personal data, but it is very rare outside of the European context. I will just end very quickly, just to leave some time perhaps for a few questions. Just to come back to the Futures of Education initiative, it is about, having looked at these probable futures, what do we want to imagine as the directions we want to go? That is essentially the aim and the spirit of the Futures of Education initiative. How to reimagine how knowledge and learning, education can shape the future of humanity and the planet. It's not only that education must help us adapt to change, but education must also help us drive and direct the change that we want to see. We have an international commission that is at work. It is chaired by the president of Ethiopia, that you see here on the image, and a range of specialists of different profiles from different regions of the world. And they have recently put out, I will not go through this, but I invite you to look at it, reaction to education in a post-COVID world, with 9 ideas for public action. We're out of time now to look at each one of these, but you can, I would like to maybe pick up just on the number 2, expanding the principle of the right to education. Today, when we speak about education, it's not only about the right to access, we must link it to issues relative to the right to information, to privacy, as we're saying before. I invite you to have a look at that specific publication and to visit our website, and we have in Arabic and in multiple languages, several platforms where you can also input your ideas and your visions and your views on education, looking at a horizon of 2050. And I'll stop here, mindful of the few minutes that we are left with. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور صبحي على هذا العرض المتميز وهذا الطرح الشمولي الذي ينم على خبرة دولية واسعة في هذا المجال. الحقيقة كنت أتابع الأسئلة التي وردت في حقل يعني الأسئلة والأجوبة، ويعني ورد عدد كبير من الأسئلة. آمل إذا صار لك فرصة أنك تمر أيضا عليها دكتور صبحي، حتى يعني لن يصعب علينا أن نأخذ سؤال ويعني نجيب عليه، ولكن سوف نأخذ بمنظور شمولي مع اطلاعك على الأسئلة وما ترى يمكن الإجابة عنها. كثير من الأسئلة بعضها قد يكون يعني في مجالات بعيدة عن مجال العرض الذي نحن في صدد هذا اليوم، ولكن وردت حقيقة عدد من الأسئلة في صميم الموضوع. لعلي أطرح بعض الأفكار العامة ثم أترك المجال للدكتور صبحي للإجابة عنها، إن رغب باللغة العربية أو اللغة الإنجليزية حسب ما يفضل. ورد أكثر من سؤال، مثلا الدكتورة صباح من اليمن تسأل على كيف فعلا يمكن أن يحدث التكامل في التعليم بين الدول تحت شعار المستقبل المشترك، وخاصة أن فيه دول تعاني من الحروب وغيرها. وأيضا الأستاذة فاطمة الكحيلي تؤكد يعني ما الأدوات اللي ممكن فعلا نقيس فيها مثل جودة هذا يعني التعليم وفق التنمية ووفق أيضا المستقبل المشترك، وهل هنالك أدوات محددة لمثل هذا الأمر. وهذا بربطه أيضا مع دكتور الفريق اللي تعمل فيه لفريق التعليم والابتكار في التعليم اللي تطرقت له، ولعلك تعطينا إضاءة حول إجابة عامة حول هذا الموضوع، وكيف ممكن فعلا ببعض التوصيات الإجرائية كما طلب عدد من المداخلين تكون موجهة مثلا إلى نطاق صناع السياسات في الدول وأيضا نطاق الممارسين التربويين في الميدان التربوي. كذلك المجال مفتوح لك يا دكتور، إذا رأيت أي سؤال تريد أيضا أن تعلق عليه. تفضل دكتور.
شكرا للأسئلة. They're not easy to respond to, but I think one thing from experience also within our region is we know the context. The context is not always most conducive to cooperation in education because of other variables. But there is a level, at a more technical level, I think there is a culture of networking that can be developed. Now, technological platforms allow this. We obviously have and need the role of regional or sub-regional organizations, ABEX being one, and I think doing an excellent job in bringing together in the sharing of experiences. This is also something that UNESCO, it is one of its functions. We, in the diversity of our contexts around the world, there's not one set, solution in or response to any particular question. But so one of the main functions is through UNESCO to convene and to allow for peer learning and exchange experiences. One of these I may mention that is coming up soon in October is the Mobile Learning Week. Some of you may be familiar with that, those of you who may be more interested in the technology angle, and in particular what we have learned from the response to educational disruption now. This will be 15th to 18th of October, virtual. But this will be looking at a range of issues around technology education, from the more technical aspects for practitioners and others to more policy level discussions, some of the issues that I have quickly touched upon. So it is, these platforms that can and should be leveraged. In terms of networking, some regions are very strong in terms of educational research, networking, and exchange of experience. It's the case in Latin America, for example. It's something that I think remains to be developed, in particular in the Middle East region. There is not much of a culture of networking at a technical level across across countries and contexts. There is much expertise, much to learn from the many innovations, but we also know that there is multiple challenges in the region, and that platforms for more technical exchange and peer learning need to be solicited by organizations like UNESCO or regional organizations like ABEX or Alexo. They're still to be developed, I would think, in the region in particular. Just wanted to react to that.
شكرا دكتور صبحي على هذه الإجابة الشاملة. الحقيقة نحن الآن في ختام اللقاء، وحنا عندنا الآن أكثر من 100 سؤال وردت في الأسئلة، وحاولت حقيقة أني أطلع عليها جميعها، وأنا متأكد أن أيضا الزملاء في مكتب التربية يعتنون بهذه الأسئلة ويبنون عليها أيضا لقاءاتهم القادمة. وكان عندنا تعليمات مشددة من مكتب التربية احتراما لوقت الجميع أن نلتزم بإنهاء اللقاء في وقته المحدد، والذي الآن قارب على الانتهاء. لعلي أختم فقط في بعض التوصيات العامة حول هذا اللقاء. أنا أعتقد أن سمعنا اليوم نظرة شمولية بخبرة عالمية، فعلا نظرة قد عندما نتحدث عن التعليم في وسط بيئة معينة قد يكون الهموم متعلقة بهذه البيئة فقط، لكن عندما نتكلم عن المستقبل المشترك للبشرية، وعندما نتكلم عنها في ظل الظروف الحالية واتضاح التأثير والتأثر بين دول العالم في جميع المجالات سواء اقتصادية أو صحية، يتبين فعلا أهمية النظرة الشمولية ودور المنظمات الدولية والإقليمية في هذا في تحقيق مثل هذا التكامل. هنا يبرز أهمية دور هذه المنظمات، منها منظمة اليونسكو اللي نتحدث عنها، أو مكتب التربية باعتباره منظمة إقليمية، أو غيرها من المنظمات الدولية اللي تسهم في مثل هذه الأمور. وهذا يتطلب حقيقة يعني أيضا يعني النظر من 3 مستويات: مستوى السياسات وصناع القرار، هذا سواء على مستوى المنظمات أو على مستوى الدول، فعلا يحتاج يعني منهم النظر في مسؤولياتهم اتجاه هذا الأمر. ولعلنا نرى جهود المملكة العربية السعودية وهي تقود الآن مجموعة ال20، وهذه الجهود نجحت بإدخال التعليم كمحور رئيس من المحاور المتعلقة بمجموعة ال20 في هذه الدورة. وحقيقة كان هنالك عدد من القضايا المتعلقة في التعليم، خاصة الطفولة المبكرة، التعليم العالمي المشترك، بعض القضايا المشتركة نجحت المملكة حقيقة في إدخالها ضمن اهتمامات الدول ال20 ومناقشاتها التي تتم خلال هذا العام. هذا الدور فعلا يحتاج الدول أن تمارسه. الجانب الآخر الدور المتعلق بالمناهج الدراسية ووجوب النظرة الشمولية، خاصة ما يتعلق بأبعاد المنهج المشترك أو cross curriculum dimensions، كيف أن فعلا نشرف فيها قيم التنمية المستدامة وقيم القيم الإنسانية المشتركة، وأيضا الجانب المستقبل المشترك. ثم على صعيد الممارسين التربويين، وتحدث أيضا الدكتور صبحي على المنصات وعلى الجهود القائمة في هذا الأمر، لابد أن نعمل ابتداء على محور معتقدات الممارسين التربويين. المعتقدات هي التي تقود بعد ذلك الممارسات، فكلما نجحنا في زيادة جرعة الوعي وتعديل وتصحيح المعتقدات التربوية اتجاه هذه القيم الإنسانية المشتركة وهذه القضايا التنمية العالمية المشتركة، كلما استطعنا فعلا أن نحقق هذا الأمر. لعلي في ختام هذا اللقاء أتقدم بوافر الشكر والتقدير للدكتور صبحي على استجابته لدعوة المكتب، ووافر الشكر والتقدير أيضا لجميع الحاضرين والمشاركين معنا سواء عن طريق زوم أو عن طريق اليوتيوب الذي يتابع معنا الآن بالآلاف. يعني زوم أخذ يعني الطاقة الاستيعابية كاملة له، وهنالك آلاف أيضا يتابعون في اليوتيوب. واللقاء يمكن يوضح الدكتور أنه سوف يكون مسجل أيضا إن شاء الله ويستفاد منه بإذن الله تعالى. ختاما أتيح الآن المجال لأخينا معالي الأستاذ الدكتور عبد السلام الجوفي لختام هذا اللقاء، وأعتذر من جميع الأخوة والأخوات الذين لم نستطع الإجابة عن أسئلتهم بشكل محدد. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور فاز، شكرا جزيلا دكتور صبحي، والشكر موصول لجميع الزملاء والزميلات من كل أقطار الوطن العربي الحاضرين معنا منذ بداية هذا اللقاء وحتى الآن، ونشكر لهم صبرهم. وأيضا شكرا للترجمة وأيضا للأخوة في الدعم الفني. وأكد تماما على أن التقييم سوف يرسل لجميع الحاضرين عبر الإيميلات مباشرة، ثم سوف تصدر شهادة الحضور لهم جميعا. ونؤكد تماما على أن جميع تساؤلاتهم وأسئلتهم سوف تكون محل عناية واعتبار للمكتب عند تنفيذ برامجه وخططها القادمة وأيضا في فعاليتها القادمة. نتمنى أن نراكم في فعاليتنا القادمة. شكرا لكم جميعا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا
جزيلا.